The Minnesota Wild have a lot of players they'd like to keep, but not a lot of money to do it with. Seth Toupal of Locked On Wild will join us to talk about the strategy for the team as they head into the offseason. All that and more coming up on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome, everybody, to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Want to thank everyone for making Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts, so you can get new episodes as soon as they drop. And we're now also available on SiriusXM. Just go to the SXM app and search for Locked On NHL. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show the host of Locked On Wild, Seth Toupal. And Seth, I know this is not the easiest offseason so far in Minnesota, but let's start with this. Matt Dumba not going to be back most likely. How does the team replace his productivity and his leadership?
Well, this is like when you go to the grocery store and you don't have, you're going to be shopping on a budget and you thought you had $20, but you go to your wallet and it turns out you have a $5 bill. So it's going to be a tight offseason money-wise, and Matt Dumba is one of the biggest dominoes to fall. He has been up and down over the last few years. Obviously, the fight that he had with one of the Tkachuk brothers a few years ago seemed to really turn him into a different player that just wasn't capable of being the threat offensively that he used to be. But it seemed like this year down the stretch, he finally kind of figured out how to be more of a defensive defenseman by being more physical, throwing his body around, but also just being more responsible, like kind of stepping up to try to be more aware of what was going on defense than he had been in the past. And it led to him playing some of the best hockey that he's played in the last few years. Now, there isn't money to make something work with Dumba unless he comes back at an extreme discount. So it's likely that he is going to be heading somewhere else because another team, preferably one closer to home for him, although Minnesota's not terribly far away. He is originally from, I believe, Calgary. So Minnesota's not terribly far away compared to some other places, but there will be teams that will be able to offer him a lot in terms of AAV and term as well. I would imagine he'd get a 2 or a 3-year deal, or maybe even a 4-year deal from somebody on the open market. So it's, at this point, it's about a 99.99% chance that he is gone. And so the big question becomes, how do you fill that spot in the lineup? Well, fortunately enough for the Minnesota Wild, they have a guy who played in the postseason in Brock Faber that is going to slot in the rookie defenseman, one of the most decorated skaters from the University of Minnesota. He ends up being a part of the Kevin Fiala trade and then gets that cup of tea at the end of the year. He immediately replaces John Merrill in the lineup for the postseason, and he played well. He played very well considering that he had played like 5 games before the postseason, and so the hope is that he will be able to slot into that spot. Now, he's not as offense-oriented as Dumba was, but he is very sound defensively and looked like a guy who had played in the league for like 10 years when he came in. So the Wild are obviously very confident in his ability to fill that spot. And I think by putting him on that second pairing with Jonas Brodin, you have a guy who is more than capable of helping out, because you're not going to, not every rookie, and not saying that Faber can't, but not every rookie is going to come in and just look the part immediately off the bat. There are going to be some growing pains, and the only way for young players to learn how to do it is a theme that I have been throwing out on Locked On Wild quite a bit recently, is learning through failure. And so Faber kind of taking some of those things in stride as they happen, some of those lapses defensively. Jonas Brodin is not a bad option to have to help kind of mitigate some of that. So I'm really excited to see what that pairing will be able to do. And so that's one where I think the Wild's kind of lucked out in that they have a pretty logical successor that can come in and fill that spot. And some of the other special teams things, Dumbo is more of a power play guy up until the last couple of years. And so you don't have to necessarily worry about filling all of those spots. It's more so just his on ice minutes. And so I think Faber's going to be able to hopefully fill pretty much all of that right off the get-go.
I know this team has a lot of restricted free agents. What's the priority as far as trying to bring them back is concerned?
Well, obviously, Philip Gustafsson is the biggest domino, and it feels like his has to be solved before any of the others can kind of get going. Although, ironically, it sounded like there was potential that Brandon Duhaime's deal could get done relatively soon. I would say in terms of importance, it's Gustafsson and then everybody else. I would love to have Brandon Duhaime back because I think he brings a nice spark. He brings great physicality, and he's kind of a high energy, high motor guy that I think the team really feeds off of. So I'd like to have him back as well. But beyond that, I don't see a ton of money available to sign like Gustav Nyquist, for instance, who was a trade deadline acquisition and looked really, really good with the team in the postseason. I think he's going to get more money elsewhere. John Klingberg, probably same story. Oscar Sundqvist, I would have loved to have seen him play more in the postseason other than just the one game. But same story there. I think these guys will be able to find bigger deals elsewhere. And so it really comes down to just trying to retain the restricted free agents, and with the fact that they have the rights to guys like Gustafsson and Duhaime, that allows you the opportunity to kind of push things down the line, maybe by a year, by just going to arbitration. I don't know that you necessarily want to do that, but you can if you need to. But beyond that, it's going to be a lot of retain, and then spots where they aren't able to sign free agents, it'll be promote and elevate from Iowa to fill some of those spots.
And any player or players off the top of your head who from Iowa you think would fit that bill?
Well, the big one is going to be Marco Rossi, who was with Iowa for pretty much the entire season last year. He added some grittiness to his game this past year, which was what the Wild coaching staff wanted him to do. It feels like there's going to be a spot for him somewhere on this roster, because another guy that you have that's a restricted free agent is Sam Steele, who was one of the predominant centers for this team. Maybe he ends up getting moved to free up a spot, but I feel like with Rossi's pedigree as a prospect, this is a year where you kind of want to see what you have with him. And so he would be one name to come up and to fill a spot. Beyond that, guys like Adam Beckman would be another one who I think could fill in the bottom six for now. He looked pretty good in his call-ups early on in the season. So he could be another name that sees some time. The other interesting one will be Jesper Wallstedt, who is the goalie of the future. And now that he's gotten a full year in his belt in Iowa, is he potentially, if there's a long-term injury to Marc-Andre Fleury or to Philip Gustafsson after he's retained, is he potentially the long-term option if somebody gets hurt? That'll be an interesting question to see if that plays out through the season too.
Sounds like an interesting off season ahead. Seth, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
I'll start with my Twitter account, which is at Seth, Toups. You can follow any of my general sports knowledge, mostly Wild content these days, although a little slower here in the off season, but you can follow me there. You can follow the show at Locked On Wild on pretty much every social media. I think we lucked out and got Locked On Wild for all of them. So just search Locked On Wild, follow us on YouTube, on your favorite podcast platforms, and we'll guide you through the off season up to the draft. And after that, I would imagine we'll start to see some things happen.
Imagine that. Seth, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for stopping by today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Today's episode is brought to you by eBay Motors. For a championship team, it's all about making sure every player is a perfect fit. Well, it's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need parts and accessories, head to eBay Motors. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, you could be sure every part you need fits right the first time around. Just add your ride to My Garage and look for the green check to know the part will fit or your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop on eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. So get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply.